Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of two webinars we're having on Bokashi. We've got well over 100 people attending, which shows the level of interest that there is. And we've got people joining us not only from the UK, but from Greece, from India, from Kenya, from Zimbabwe, and from South Africa. So there's a lot of interest in this. Back in 1961, I went to study agriculture at the University of Newcastle, and we had a lecturer in soil chemistry called Mr. Hunter, and we had a lecturer in soil physics called Dr. Pringle, and she was also Scotland's hockey captain, and Dr. Pringle and Mr. Hunter were married. We had no soil biology. There was no lecture in soil biology. That was 1961. We had soil physics, we had soil chemistry, no soil biology. And the whole world of, of chemical companies are already infiltrated farming and the university system. Over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of interest growing in soil health. And I remember 4 years ago in 2017, we ran a webinar at, we ran a meeting at Fir Farm on monitoring the pulse of the soil. How could we monitor the pulse of the soil, thinking of the soil as being alive? And we thought we were quite forward thinking. And then last year, I learned that in 2016, a year before we started, the state of Sikkim in the Himalayas in India had gone wholly organic after a period of 10 years and realized that we were behind the curve. And the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, with 54 million people, same as this population of the UK, they are also in the process. They call it natural farming, but effectively it's organic, and it's focused around the dung and the urine of the cow. So we in the West sometimes think we're leading, but I feel in many ways we're actually following others in Africa and Asia. I first came across Bokashi EM in more than 20 years ago when I went to stay on the farm with James Moffett, who's going to be speaking later. And we had EM was everywhere. Bokashi was everywhere. It was used right across the farm. It was even in the drinking water. And I'm pleased to say that I'm here to say I survived the experience. So I got really interested in it, and I had a Bokashi compost system at home and so on. So when this came up, the opportunity of Bokashi, I thought it'd be really good if we could start by taking a wider look, more of an international perspective. Hence, today we've got Jan is from the Netherlands, although he's working in here at the moment. And then we've got Mambud, all being well. We're still trying to get him in from Sierra Leone. And then James from South Africa. So we'll start with Jan, and there's a Q&A box, so put your questions in there, please. We'll address the questions at the end. There are two sets of slides being shown, and a link to those will be provided in the chat box as they come up, because there's a lot of detail in there that you may well want to look at. So Jan, who's going to speak first, is the director of Agriton. It's a company with a social mission that aims to make agriculture and horticulture more sustainable. They specialize in solutions that increase soil fertility, making extensive use of microbiology. And his great passion is to ensure that the cycle of the soil, plant, animal fertilizer becomes better attuned, looking forward to the health of the soil and the farmer and the people who eat the food that the farmers eat. So Jan, I pass it over to you. Many thanks and welcome.
Thank you very much, John, for this introduction. I know that I have, say, 15 to 20 minutes, and I can tell you that I started with Bokashi in 1997. And I can't put all those years together in 15 minutes. when the question came, I said, yes, more or less, I don't know where to start and where to end. And that is why I didn't make slides or a presentation, because I think I would like to tell you a little bit more how the whole story came to me and what I've done with it. I studied agriculture. I'm an agriculture engineer, and I studied microbiology, biochemistry, and especially organic chemistry. And microbiology, that were the 4 topics when I was at university. After that, I worked for 17 years in the pesticide and fertilizer industry. I worked with Monsanto, I worked for what is now Dow, I worked with all the big companies. And my company where I worked then was one of the biggest suppliers in the Dutch agriculture for pesticides and fertilizers. During those years, I worked there 17 years, it became very clear to me that we needed, in a period, even more pesticides and more fertilizer and everything more to have, on the end, a good yield. So the cost went up and production went up, but most of the time when production goes up, price goes down. So the end was that farmers had more and more a hard life to get from a normal farm a good income. But what I discovered as well, farms where I did advising for 17 years, they needed more power to plow the fields. I saw less and less seagulls behind the plow because there were less and less earthworms. And that brought me to think. And then on a certain moment, I heard a lecture from a guy who was then, on those days, actually promoting EM in the Netherlands, Frits van der Ham. And when he did his talk, it was a talk like, this is the magic potion. You don't need anything anymore than EM. The bananas will be huge. The cucumbers will be huge. Everything will be fantastic. No pesticides, no fertilizers. Well, to be honest, I didn't believe a lot of that because I heard so many of those stories. Nevertheless, there were a few things in his lecture what stick to me, because that was, I thought, correct what he said. Some things about microbiology and how microbiology behaves in prey-predator balances. And that made me think. And there was quite a bit of organic chemistry, what he was telling about, what also enclaved. And I said, well, I go into this story. And I went to him, and I think then we were the first pesticide selling company in the Netherlands which used EM as a slurry additive and as a silage additive. When I, later on, 2 years or 3 years later, I took half of the shares of that company, and when I was in the company, I saw there a so-called Bokashi bucket. And I asked him, what is this? Well, he said, that is a Bokashi bucket, Jan. I said, what can you do with it? And he told me the story that you could have all your organic, what we called waste, transformed into fertilizers in the soil. If you come from a farmer and especially dairy background, and you looked at the old system, farmyard manure was collected on the dairy farms in the Netherlands, that was a piece of art, because the manure were collected, was put on a heap, and it had to be square, and it had to be sheltered for rain. And as farmyard manure is very wet, it was an anaerobic system. And the farmers then knew that, well, if you could do 10 tons of that farmyard manure, or they could choose today for 10 tons of that and 32 tons of slurry, they will all choose for farmyard manure. And fields use that farmyard manure. If you dig holes, were always a lot of worms and everything. That made me think that it looked quite a bit like making Bokashi, because that is also an anaerobic system. And what is then the clue in that? Well, for me, it came quite easily clear that everything what is, if you look to the circle of life, how it works, the prey-predator model, because that is what we all are in this, on our planet. It is eat or be eaten, more or less, yeah, has to do with energy. So energy is the key of everything what is alive. If you go to a plant can take energy from the sun and need some nutrients from the soil, and then it grows. A big tree, for example, eats only a few 100 grams of soil, really, to become a huge tree. The rest is energy from the sun. In that combination, the tree is leaking a lot of energy into the soil where the whole microbiome is living from. And in exchange of that, that microbiome in the soil releases nutrients where the tree can. So it's an ideal symbiosis, as we call. But if there is nothing on a field, no grass, so as we plow and everything, what should that huge microbiome, what is there, what it has to eat? There is no food when there is not a crop. So there is no capture of carbohydrates, what goes into the soil, what can keep that huge life in the soil active. In the Netherlands, there is said if you have one cow on the soil, you have 7 cows beneath the soil. So that is, and if we do arable, we plow in the winter, the soil is bare, there's nothing there. We have to feed it. And that means what we bring has to have carbohydrates because that is food. Life in the soil can't photosynthesize. So we have to bring as much organic matter, was said. But I think we should bring as much as digestible organic matter. Because if we don't bring digestible organic matter, it is like feeding a cow. If you feed a cow, you can bring him. I sometimes in a lecture, I say to the farmers in the audience that if you can make a choice, you have a field, 10 hectares, you make from 5 hectares a nice silage, and you make from the other 5 hectares compost. It's on you from which to you feed your cows to make milk. There was one in the audience in the front said to me, "What a silly question." I said, "Yes, now I are. That is a silly question because you know what? Well, I said, I take the silage. No, I don't feed my cow with compost because they won't give milk. The difference, if I have 100 tons of grass, dry matter, and I make from that 100 tons of grass dry matter compost, there is 50 tons of dry matter left. So we're losing 50% of the heat, more or less, as CO2 because our elements, a little bit of nitrogen there, won't evaporate. So the energy is gone. And in fertilizers, there's totally no energy. Yeah, the only energy source what you can bring is maybe what urea, what is chemically seen an organic fertilizer. Yeah. So we need the energy in the soil. And that is actually what is the drive to start with Bokashi. But if you have an anaerobic system and you ferment your material, that is more or less, I said in other lectures, I sometimes say to people, well, listen, for 5 liters of beer, yeah, I need 1 kilogram of barley. I need a little bit of yeast, a little bit of hops, and I need 5.5 liters of water. Yeah, and I make from that 5 liters of beer. And if I go look at that and I say, okay, you can eat that barley raw, or you can drink the beer, what brings your body more energy? Well, it's quite obvious. The beer, well, you bring more calories than the barley raw. Another very simple example is for if you have milk and you make from milk yogurt and you count the calories in what is in 100 grams of milk and 100 grams of yogurt. Strange enough, through the fermentation, the calories, or megajoules as you want, in yogurt are higher than in milk. So our body can take more energy from the yogurt than from the milk. Fermentation. And this fermentation is very important to transform energy from one form into another form. And the more, and this is a microbial process, microbes, the first microbes who eat something, most of the time produce excrements, what is feed for the next generation again. So instead of burning what is oxidizing, you're losing all the energy at once. In fermentation, you do it stepwise. And every step between takes a little bit of energy. But that step between what is another living organism is at the same moment food for the group what is above. So instead of breaking totally all the energy away with Bokashi, you are working on a system of slowly breaking down But on the same moment, the group of microbes who are living on that substrate are food for the generation up. So instead of breaking everything down to zero, on the same moment you go with little loss, you go a little bit down. On the same moment, the other force of growth goes on, moves on. So you don't have what a lot of people working in the compost industry and also in the agriculture industry say that all energy has to be broken down to zero. That is not true. If that was true, we couldn't live. What we eat, and the moment we eat our food, just it is by the whole digestion system, that on the same moment we keep this body going. And even in our excrements is still energy for other microbes. So our body is no more and no less than a microbial carrier. We are full with microbes. We are not green, we can't photosynthesize, so we need food from somewhere. So that goes into your mouth. And in your body, your microbes keeping you warm. Yeah, your microbes, if you eat more than you use, you grow. But if you grow, your population of microbes is growing. Yeah, and when the system is collapsing, so it doesn't work anymore, your inner microbes get so much hungry, they start to eat you from inside. So we as human beings, we are also a part of that circle. We should try to lose as less as possible these energies. And Bokashi is one way. It's not the only way. There are a lot of other ways. But for example, another very good way is keep your soil always covered. Yeah, but that is another topic. If you keep feeding your soil, you should feed your soil the whole year on. Constantly see that there is something there, because the soil is a living entity. If you dare have a slowly breakdown, what you see, and a beautiful example is a forest. If you have bare soil, it starts first with grass and weeds. If you let them go, on a certain moment, you will see trees will grow. Yeah, leaves fall down. And then that is also fermentation in very small amounts. That is aerobic fermentation, can be done as well, but then the temperature stays low. If this process continues during the breakdown, you have a build up. And what will you see when you leave a field for, say, 10 years bare? There you find trees, you find shrubs, you will find grasses, you find weeds. But the most important thing is, if you take a soil sample after 10 years, your organic matter content of actually your humus content in your soils goes up. And it is improving that soil. So it is farming with Bokashi. Bokashi is just a tool. But understanding the whole process is actually what we should do. Farming today should understand the whole process more and more. Unfortunately, we are more and more on the chemical way of farming. Lucky enough, in the last 25 years, I've seen slowly but steady growth of people who want to understand this and farm on a different way. Well, this is for me a small introduction, how I came to Bokashi, what we do with Bokashi, and why it is so important. Bokashi is not a magic potion, what some people believe. Yeah, and Bokashi is just a tool. And we should use that tool, but try to understand the full circle. Yeah, the full circle of life, because everybody who listens now is part of that full circle. Yeah, and if we think that we can rule nature, you will be surprised, and we can see that nature will rule you. Thank you.
Okay, Jan, thank you very much. Well, I can sense your passion.
Thank you.
As well as your experience, and I warmed to that that concept of pile of farmyard manure as a work of art, because I've been thinking about that myself when I was a farm student way back in the 1950s. Farmyard manure was so precious and collected and taken out onto the farm. So that's thank you very much for that introduction. We're going to go now to somewhere quite different. We're going to go to Mambud, who's in Sierra Leone. And Mambud a bit of background, was displaced by the war. There was a terrible civil war in Sierra Leone in 2001. And like many, many people, Mambud was displaced to Guinea. And in 2001, when the war was beginning to come to an end, he established the Sierra Leone Single Leg Amputee Sports Association to give joy and meaning and dignity to the people who's had, many people who've had their legs amputated and arms amputated during that awful war. Now, in 2010, the UN Secretary General, Ban KiMoon, came to Sierra Leone and gave SLASA, as it's called for short, he gave them 10 acres of land to develop as a farm, but they were never able to develop it. And in 2018, Mambud had the chance to go to the Asian Rural Institute in Japan for 10 months and learned about agroecology and permaculture. And when he came back in last year, 2020, we were able to get £20,000 from Lush to transform that bare piece of land into an amazing farm that it is now. And those of you who went to the Oxford Real Farming Conference will have seen that. So Mambud's been using Bokashi for quite some time. It's different to, as you'll see, it's not based on the effective microorganisms, which is the stuff that you can purchase, but it's based on taking the soil organisms from the forest. Now, I first went to Sierra Leone in 1979, and then I was back again in 2001 when Mambud was in Guinea. We didn't meet, but I was working on trying to help to rebuild the rural economy at that time. And I met Mambud in 2012 when I took my son Tom, and they were playing football on crutches on the beach in Freetown. And my son Tom later wrote their theme song for them when they got through to the finals of the World Cup. But sadly, Ebola didn't allow that to happen. And this year, Farming on Crutches, which is what we're calling this, is being showcased at Groundswell. So if you're going, there's an opportunity to support them. Mambud, would you like to share your screen? And we'll hear your story. Mambud from Sierra Leone.
Yes, John.
Go ahead, Mambud. It's all good.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, to share my learning experience that we did 3 years ago in Japan. I had the opportunity to, with a scholarship to study sustainable agriculture, and Bokashi being our key, learning process, because Sierra Institute practice organic farming. And since I'm a rural leader, from Sierra Leone community, so I have been introduced to that approach because we want to support the damages which chemical fertilizers has caused on our community, also on human health, also on economy. Farmers in my community, my country, continue to be poor because of the high purchases, in chemical fertilizers. There are so many illness, going to hospital related to the toxic, the toxic food that we are taking through chemical fertilizers. And so at Japan, we are learned, how to, what could be the remedy, what could be, the solutions, to getting, taking healthy food, safe food for my family, for my community, and even for my country. So I am Mambud, and I work with the Amputees, Sierra Leone Single Leg Amputee Association. We play football on crutches, and now we are doing farming on crutches. That's very, very, very important. Today, I would like to talk to you about the chemistry and biological diversity of Bokashi. And as I said, you can see our field where majority of our staff are one-legged or one-hand amputees, you know. Yeah, so we have about 350 across the country, and we have 5 teams, you know, 5 sections in the country, and we are also trying to replicate these beautiful things that we have started last year. So Bokashi becomes a very big, good opportunity that we can know. We want to know the meaning of Bokashi. Why do we use Bokashi? How do we know Bokashi is versatile compared to chemical fertilizers or maybe compost? Why does Bokashi use fermentation? What are Bokashi's ingredients? What are the process of Bokashi preparation, and how and where to collect the indigenous microorganisms? How and when to use Bokashi? So briefly, this is what we learned from Japan about Bokashi, and this is also what I am practicing in my community. And also 3 years ago, I came and introduced organic farming system to 150 farmers, local farmers in my country, so that we can practice this organic fertilizer process. So the photos here show my farm and how you can see amputee, you know, preparing Bokashi. So it's not a very big, difficult things that we can do. You only need to also have all your materials, you know, all the materials involved in Bokashi. So we say Bokashi is a fermented fertilizer made by mixing organic matters, soil, you know, baucha, rice husk charcoal, wood charcoal, with ingredient, you know, with indigenous microorganisms. So Bokashi, it means thinning. It's a process whereby, you know, unlike traditional fertilizer, you know, soil is added to the organic matters, and the mixture is being fermented. So that process, that thinning process, that gradation process is what we call Bokashi. So here you need to have your materials all available. And for my learning opportunities today, I have also gathered my materials for Bokashi. Sorry, maybe we can just we can see like the soil, which should be part of the process. You need to have your soil, maybe topsoil will be good. And then for us in Sierra Leone, we are using chicken manure because this is our local resource that easily affordable. And we eat a lot of rice in Sierra Leone. It is our staple food. So I have a rice brown, which I have to use for carbohydrate in my Bokashi. And then we have a baucha, which is rice husk charcoal. We can use also in Bokashi. Then for making your indigenous microorganism, you have you need this brown sugar. We were recommended to use brown sugar so that it will easily fermentation will easily take place. Then you have your same rice. We have cooked this rice this afternoon so that we can show how this rice, indigenous microorganisms, will be collected through this rice. Of course, I also have my bamboo shoot, maybe 1 centimeter bamboo shoot here, which we can just open it, split it very easily, and we can put our rice stem and take to the forest to gather our indigenous microorganism. So you need to have your bucket, or your, you know, this is water cam, a demonstration water cam that you need to have maybe 50% of water solution using Bokashi. So why do we use Bokashi? Here is my field in Sierra Leone at a permaculture agroecology farm. We say Bokashi removes harmful gases. One of the biggest information there, because if we use raw materials, you know, sometimes it creates a lot of this harmful gas. So it removes this methane and the ammonia gases from the soil. So it doesn't have strong smell at all. But also we saw that fermentation reduces the high nitrogen content when we use Bokashi. You know, we can see that the manure that bonds around the root zone of the plant couldn't happen in the case when you use Bokashi. We also make sure that when we use Bokashi, it attracts, prevent, harmful insects, because raw materials, when they are used, then we are bringing a lot of harmful insects into the farm. So when we use Bokashi, the nutrients more accessible to the plant instead of bringing, encouraging, harmful insects on our plant. Bokashi can be stored for up to 1 year. So once we make it, we can use for 6 months and more than 6 months, and it can also be stored without degrading. So as long as indigenous microorganisms are used, nearly any organic matter can be decomposed and turned into fertilizer. So this is the very good part of Bokashi, but also the process is appropriate because it has a very good environment. It encourages a very good environment for interaction with indigenous microorganisms, plants, and the soil. So you see a lot of ecosystem and biodiversity playing where we are using Bokashi. To compare Bokashi with other chemical fertilizers or compost, we could see the dangers, chemical fertilizer is causing when we look at the blue column. That is the dangers chemical fertilizer is causing, and we cannot even want to consider it. But then we want to look at the main materials used in Bokashi, and for compost, we can see that almost same organic matter can be used, such as cow dung, chicken, pig dung, chicken dung, manure oil cakes, all this kind of raw material, rice bran, fish meal. So all these materials we can use, to making our Bokashi for fermentation. So under fermentation, we saw that materials are fermented very slowly in compost, but with Bokashi, materials are fermented very quickly. So for period of making Bokashi, in Japan and in Sierra Leone, we can use compost for up to maybe 1 year, for fermentation, for period to be completed. But with Bokashi, we only use 14 days, maybe 2 weeks. Bokashi is ready to use, on your farm. So we look at the effect of improving soil. So both improve the soil, the best effect for soil improvement, both compost and Bokashi. So for microorganisms, we see that a few microorganisms are in compost, but with Bokashi, more microorganisms they are for living fertilizer. And prevention of disease and insect, we know that both compost and Bokashi have effective preventive pest control. So that is how we can compare them. And then how do we know it is versatile? This is why this is the biodiversity display. We always have to, before we prepare Bokashi, we go to the forest, where we can find a lot of ecology and biodiversity in play. So fermentation, a type of chemical reactions caused by microorganisms or enzymes that split complex, organic compounds into relative simple substances. So with Bokashi, it does not only decompose these organic compounds to absorb nutrients for plants, but also Bokashi produces plant hormones. It produces vitamins and high energy phosphoric acid for our for our fertilizer. And so we have to visit the forest and to prepare our Bokashi. The ingredients for Bokashi for us in Sierra Leone and which we also using in Japan, we say almost any organic materials can be used, any organic material. So we use the resources that are available to us, when you are using Bokashi. So the recipe for Bokashi manure. So for manure, we use chicken manure, which is 7 container. And you could see this container here, maybe 46 liter container. You can choose your own container. Somebody will say, oh, well, maybe very difficult to turn. You can just use your container, sizable enough to do your turning. So chicken manure is like a seven parts, 7 container. You need carbohydrate. And so we choose rice bran. Maybe if you don't have rice, you can use cassava, you can use barley, you can use soybean, you can use wheat. You know, if at all you don't have rice bran, you can use those kind of things to replace your carbohydrate. You can use baucha, and we are using rice husk charcoal, you know, and that is 2 parts. Carbohydrate is 1 container. Rice husk charcoal is 2 container. Then you get indigenous microorganisms 3, which you can use 4 to 5 handful into the mixture. We'll be learning how to collect indigenous microorganisms also. Soil, the just topsoil, you can use 5 containers, water 50%, and Bokashi need air, you know, to get that done. So this is a standard container that we are using in Sierra Leone, and to measure our components. Here we see the different measures, you know, different component or ingredient, you know, available in each of the components we are mixing with, we are mixing in the Bokashi preparation. And so these materials are available. Maybe for the short time I have to present, I will not be able to go through all of them one by one. But then you can see manure, which is 7 container, which contains nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It contains trace minerals. It's broken down by indigenous microorganisms. So we have a lot of this. All this you can read after my presentation. You have access to it through John Meadley. For local modifications, we say we can, whatever you have is around, whatever you need is around you in organic farming. Whatever you need is around you. So we are using local resources in making Bokashi, so that farmers will be, we move from the burden, you know, of raising money, going to the shop, you know, to look for chemical fertilizer. So Bokashi, you can use local resources. So for nitrogen, we can use fish meal, oil cake, chicken manure, fish ammonia acid. You can use any of those ingredients for to get your nitrogen. And then for phosphorus, you can use maybe bone powder, rice bran, chicken manure, water-soluble calcium phosphate, WCAP. So you can use any of those components or ingredients, you know, to make your Bokashi. Also, you need potassium, as effect of decreasing charms, such as maybe chicken manure, stems of banana or tobacco. So you can use any one of those things in preparing your Bokashi.
Mambud,
Hi.
you just,
yes.
Can you speed up a bit? I know you've got a long way to go and on your talk, so maybe you can speed up a bit. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So common ratios in Bokashi applications. Here we say already crops that are planted, you know, by transplanting, we can use a handful of Bokashi onto the plant. But then for also wide field, maybe for wheat, for barley, you can use 200 kg per 0.1 hectare. You know, you can just broadcast, scatter, you know, your Bokashi. Collecting the Bokashi, the IMO, we have IMO 1, 2, and 3. So for IMO 1, where you cook the rice and then put it in the bamboo, you know, put it in the bamboo shoot, and then take it to the forest, you know, for 3 days for hot weather conditions and 5 days for cool weather conditions. Leave it in the forest for that time, and then you go to IMO 2. You remove your bamboo shoot and then bring it, and then it already would have gathered a lot of thousands of microorganisms, which you will mix with sugar, you know, with brown sugar, and keep in the jar, you know, for a week. You know, IMO 3 is where you dilute, you know, the mixture with water, with soil, and then that is actually your IMO that you have collected to make the Bokashi. So this is the process of making the indigenous microorganism. You first of all cook your rice. Step 1, step 2, you put it in the bamboo shoot. Step 3, you take it to the forest. Step 4, you bury it maybe 20 centimeter deep, and then you wait for 5 days for those of you in cool weather conditions. And then step 5, It's where you take it and then you will see we have done this this week. So that was the time we took it to the forest. And now when we remove it from the forest, you could see white mold, you know, those white mold. And then now the content has become very smaller, meaning that a lot of microorganisms are here. And then we have this jar in the farm where we will keep it. We put a paper on the mouth and tie it and keep it for 1 week. So you don't have to put plastic because indigenous microorganisms needs air. So you just put paper, you know, and tie it, and then you wait for for 1 week, and then it will turn into liquid where you will mix that with water to get your IOM3. So this IOM3 is what you will use, you know, to make your Bokashi. Now preparing the Bokashi, we create a base. This is our farm and our workers there. You create a base, adding the manure and soil to a pile. Then number 2, you mix the soil and manure thoroughly with shovel, as we are doing in photo 2. And then 3, we can see add water while mixing to cut down the dust. And then 4, we add rice bran and rice husk charcoal and continue to mix. And you can see stage 5, we apply the indigenous microorganism 3 and continue to mix while adding water. We need to add water. And how do we know? We check the moisture content of the Bokashi. You can do this by squeezing a handful of the mixture so to form a ball. So once it's formed a ball, then that is very good. If at all it still has dust, then add some water. Stage 7, we cover the Bokashi with a blanket or rice straw. Bokashi requires air circulation, so don't put plastic. Don't use plastic. Use either maybe your blanket. Number 8, you monitor the temperature of the Bokashi. This is also very important. If the Bokashi reaches 50 degrees centigrade, you know, turn the pile to cool down its temperature to give oxygen to the microorganisms. Stage 9, turn the Bokashi once every day until the temperature becomes same as air temperature. This usually takes maybe 7 days. So 7 days, you will be doing this work because Bokashi takes only 2 weeks. So we'll be working on it every week, every day to make sure that it is already cooled down. And once it is cooled down, stage 10, you dry your Bokashi so that you can store for 6 months to 1 year. Then you can use. You see, this is a number of Bokashi we have kept, you know, so that we can use. So don't put it under the sun because it's also sunlight. Direct sunlight will kill the indigenous microorganisms in it. So sometimes we just put it there without tying, and then we just open the Bokashi so that air will circulate. And in our farm, we have this small house where we keep our Bokashi in Sierra Leone. So this is our small house at the side of our farm to keep our Bokashi. Then we can come to the use of how do we use this Bokashi for transplanting. We have you open the soil, and then this is like these are just examples for like leaf vegetables, bell pepper and pumpkin and chili. These are the use how we do. We put a rice husk charcoal 1 hand and Bokashi 2 hands, and then we put the plantations, and then you just plant like that. And therefore, this is community field where we are planting groundnut. And so what we do, we broadcast, you know, we scatter the Bokashi all over and turn with the soil, and then we can plant, you know, our seeds, you know, that there. Here is in Japan when we were there for 3 years ago. And then a field like this, we can just broadcast our Bokashi on the soil surface, you know, 200 kg at 0.1 hectare. And then from there, we plant our rice, and you could see how that one goes. Thank you so much. I think this is the end of my presentation.
Mambud, thank you so much. That's really very inspiring, particularly when we remember that you only started the farm 15 months ago, and yes, that many of the people you work with are amputees. I'm talking to the rest of you now. Mambud and I have been in touch a lot recently about preparing for this talk, and we were concerned about the power outages, and Mambud has kindly managed to get a generator going. so that we could have power. The conditions they work with there are very difficult, and we're most grateful to you, Mambud, for sharing this with you. And a short while ago, we managed to raise some funds to get a solar pump, and on Sunday it was wonderful actually when the solar pump began to work, and water could begin to irrigate the crops. But I think it's very encouraging to see this farm being run with Bokashi, and of course here Bokashi is the process is aerobic, and that's quite in contrast to what I learned early on when I read Professor Heek's book with the 50 bugs that he chose. So thank you very much, Mambud. Now we're going to move straight on to James Moffett, and one of the comments that made, we had a dry run on this earlier in the week, and one of the comments made by the farmers was, well, what Mambud is doing is great, but it's quite small and it's done with labor, and we could you unshare your screen, Mambud? It's quite small, labor's expensive here. How do we do it at scale? So it's very appropriate now that we have James. He's one of South Africa's leading practitioners of sustainable farming, and he's pioneered and continued to pioneer and practice organic farming in South Africa on a wide range of enterprises, crops, vegetables, cattle. He became organic in 1996. And he was for a time the chair of the Organic Farmers Association. I first met James more than 20 years ago, and I've been onto the farm many times and seen Bokashi in action. As I say, I've survived it being in the drinking water. James is farming nearly 3,000 hectares at scale, with Bokashi being the main source of feeding the soil and looking after the animals and the crops. So James, over to you to share your screen, and many thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John. There we go. Is that everybody can see that, I guess? Thank you so much, John. I grew up on this farm, and with training in archaeology, accounting, economics, law, and marketing, started farming in 1990. My father had farmed low input sustainable agriculture, which some people may remember, with a wide variety of crops, including maize, wheat, cattle, sheep, and I was inspired to learn from the bottom up. My travels in the United States had fanned the spark of organics flickering, a legacy of my mother. And in 1990, we planted fruit trees, which went organic, ultimately exporting peaches to Germany for baby food. And in 1996, the South African EM distributor paid a visit, and brief one-day crash course inoculated me in the theory and practice of effective microorganisms. All due respect to my father, who encouraged, enabled, and criticized my love of organics in both theory and practice. In Curtington, prior to 1990, followed the industrial agricultural model, linear, mechanistic, and high external, unsustainable energy user. And you'll note that the soil is presented as already severely depleted in nutrient and micro and macro soil life, on a downward trajectory, mirroring our own existential crisis and mindset or paradigm. Sir Albert Howard and Lady Eva Balfour, stalwarts of organic agriculture in the late 1800s, encouraged farmers to mimic nature, the exact opposite of this present model. However, their legacy was the fundamental solution to my crisis, both at farm level and thinking or my mind level. I discovered that the most prolific, unrecognized, multidisciplinary, holistic movement on Kirklington farm and myself was microorganisms, a seething beyond comprehension mass of both beneficial and harmful individuals operating everywhere. In hindsight, this idea represented by the microorganisms and themselves was the foundation I required. When effective microorganisms, or EM, and Bokashi arrived at my farm gate, my education, thus the farm's rehabilitation, began in earnest. Jan and Mambud have covered some of the information in this infogram and flowchart of EM and Bokashi, so I won't repeat what they've said, but it pretty much follows exactly what's going on. The difference is the indigenous microbes which Mambud uses, and at the time we went straight for the what we call stock EM, or EM1, which is a concentrate one buys and then multiplies, as you can see, 100 times on farm using molasses and water. And in that state, which at this stage the stock EM or EM1 costs approximately 5 British pounds. So when you multiply it by 100 times and you continue the multiplication in making it down into your fermented plant extract products, and also at the rates you're applying here, the actual cost of the original stock EM becomes almost negligible in your calculations. What costs more is the actual making of the derivatives in time and labor possibly, and also then the application on the fields. So with time and resources being limited, the ease of access of buying stock EM or EM1 with the huge financial benefits of on-farm multiplying into a wide range of inputs and remedies with good empirical evidence of success all over the world made sense in all spheres. Then people recognize it's the financial, social, environmental, and in my case, I added a spiritual sphere. My strong belief in nature and holism had me farm microbes and to restoring and with microbes. My objective was the foundation for our association in building a whole farm with health.
Right, I'm sorry, it looks like we've lost James. James, you there?
I've just come back on, John. I see everybody there.
Thanks.
Okay. I'm just going to share the screen again. Can everybody see the screen?
No, it's coming.
Okay, we're back on.
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. That's the local glitches with weather. I'm just trying to move the that a bit. Okay, so the costs of Bokashi will vary from farm to farm on a commercial scale, with all the variables such as on-farm resources, cost and transport of off-farm inputs. So if you have to bring in the main ingredients like bran or manure. These are my costings, which had the advantage of on-farm resources of bran, oil cake, and sheep manure. And when I've done the numbers and I've converted my South African rands into British pounds, and you can look at the graph there of making the brand Bokashi, these numbers made sense to me. And this is not even taking into account the significant benefits which would accrue once we started using it over the long term. So initial farm trials were successful both in making the multiplied EM and also making the Bokashi from the bran and many of the microbial derivatives which you saw in the previous graph. And we started applying them on crops, fruit, livestock, and as John mentioned, to us as well in our drinking water and also in our washing. And we quickly learned it was easy to expand production of those microorganisms using existing equipment. We didn't go out and buy anything new. So we had 20-liter plastic drums, empty drums of molasses bearing origin. These became the brewing tanks, graduating to 210-liter tanks, and finally 1,000-liter plastic tanks. And having a mill producing wheat and rye and maize flour meant large quantities of bran were available on farm, which could be converted into bokashi in our feed mixer. With rainwater, molasses, farm-made charcoal and sunflower oil came from our oil press and multiplied that completed the recipe for ongoing bokashi production. Quantities, of course, varying depending on season and demand. We measured the quantities as per the recipe, as you can see on the screen there, and mixed a lot in our feed mixer, that roller feed mixer you can see at the bottom, which was already on farm. So another equipment that was reutilized. And once uniform and well mixed, it was measured off in plastic airtight bags for fermentation of about 25 kgs each. This was packed and then monitored weekly for 10 to 12 weeks of fermentation until the white spores that Mambud mentioned appeared in his bokashi, and then the characteristic very sweet sour smell of bokashi being strong, and these are ready for use. Of course, this method is labor intensive. At the same time, because we had sheep manure, we trialed aerobic sheep manure bokashi with great success, much like Mambud has done. And this was the byproduct of crawling or corralling the sheep flock. And this was broadcast on fields using a chain spreader, which we already had, and we adapted the lime spreader to do it more accurately when it came to bokashi. The sheep manure was sprayed with a mixture of multiplied EM, molasses and water in the same ratio for brand bokashi of 1:100, and mixed using a front-end loader. The pile was then heaped in a windrow, turned with the front-end loader to introduce oxygen and facilitate the aerobic process. Point of lay and broiler chicken manure bought in was converted using microbes and molasses as per the sheep manure into chicken manure bokashi or CMB. However, the high cost of aerobic production, that is the turning with equipment, which meant diesel and time, led us to experiment with large-scale anaerobic fermented bokashi, as mentioned by Jan. A process no different to traditional silage making. The difference being adding these effective microbes. On testing the silage method of making bokashi on scale and finding it more cost effective, we followed the same mixing process, but then compacted the windrow, sprayed it with a final mix of multiplied EM, molasses and water, and covered it with a plastic sheet weighted down with tires to keep air from entering. And depending on the season, the fermented bokashi was ready in 3 months for broadcasting onto the fields. As you would like to learn, that planning is very important to determine the yearly usage and bringing in, if you need extra chicken manure on time to convert. So as we became more confident in the use and efficient production of microorganisms and their protege EM and bokashi, we reduced and replaced commercial acidic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, which saved money, and at the same time the whole health of the farm life improved, from the soil to the water. A total farm blanket strategy of applying microbes in liquid and solid bokashi form was adopted. Everything and everyone was to be beneficial microorganism recipients. We applied microbes to all summer crops, starting with inoculating the soil when prepping the fields, soaking the seed in multiplied EM, planting with bran and sheep or chicken manure bokashi, and spraying multiplied EM while cultivating or fermented plant extract, which was a very cheap form of applying different nutrients that have been extracted from the fermented plants. But make no mistake, we made many mistakes, and from those mistakes we try to fix every time. We got better and better. So we had a very diverse farm. I think I may have skipped a slide back there, which I'd like to go back to show you that one. That you saw there earlier. I can't go back on the thing, I beg your pardon. So I'm just going to stick to the thing that the mechanistic model was changing as we introduced more crops and value adding, which is very important for making it sustainable. And of course, with the new government we had, there were no longer any subsidies at all, bar a little bit on the diesel that we used on farm. We didn't have to pay a tax on that. So we started value adding to the crops. So you heard we had sunflower oil cake, and the premium product was the sunflower oil, which we then sold into the supermarkets, and then of course the flour, which we sold as well. So in the winter crops, a whole lot of different crops were brought in. We were already producing wheat and rye. I brought in spelt, triticale, and barley, which was meant for beer making, as Jan mentioned there. And then also we adapted and adopted our equipment to apply the EM, from putting a tanker behind the driver and just dosing the EM, multiplied EM, directly into behind the tines into the soil at a high concentration of multiplied EM. On the wheat drill, we mounted a simple boom, which came a tank at front, carried the microorganisms, which was pumped with a power takeoff pump through that and sprayed while we drilled the wheat. At all simple, I beg your pardon, experiments, innovation, intuition, correspondence, prayer at times was needed, meditation, reading, studying, learning, carried on and on as we learned more and more in this process. Remembering that we were converting at the same time from a commercial chemical operation to a organic operation to be certified at some stage, which became in 1996. Of course, pastures being important to the cattle, our aim was to produce good food for fauna and flora, and the outcome was the soil community, plants, livestock, bugs, bees and birds all benefiting. As with cash crops, we applied microbes everywhere on annuals and perennials, while using holistic methods such as seed mixes, drought-resilient legumes, and enhancing old and tired pastures of aerograsses by seeding Serradella into them. And onto the livestock. My aim was to disease prevention with pathogen suppressing beneficial microbes in the livestock. Was relatively 5% depending on the age. The spray crop dilution. I'm back on screen again. So in wet weather, when the kraal became muddy, we fed big bells, which broke down and spread with night feeding, was sprayed with EM. Poaching problems extended to our cattle, so counting daily was mandatory, and adding EM to their drinking water was easy, and adding Bokashi and multiplied microbes to their licks also could happen at the same time. So one of the important functions of beneficial microbes is that they are very effective in controlling foul smells and fly numbers. Hydrogen sulfide, as farmers will know, and ammonia are harmful and cause physical damage and impairs oxygen transportation. So microorganisms utilize these hydrogen bonds in gases and in ammonia, breaking them down, reducing the smells and reduce flies, the vectors. So when manure is treated with microbes, a specific microbe, Actomycetes, breaks down the chitin and prevents the fly larvae from developing into pupa from which a fly can hatch. So the reduction of smells and flies ultimately led to less stress, a better immune system, better performance of the animals. And to combat, for example, internal parasites, worms and diarrhea, we would dose microbes at 50 milliliters per small stock unit and at 200 milliliters per large stock unit. And EM is extremely successful in prophylactically preventing and treating bacterial infections like mastitis. If we picked up mastitis in the calves, I beg your pardon, in the cows and the ewes, we would inject 20 to 50 milliliters of EM directly into the teat of the cow and the sheep. And then that would then not need milking, but the calf or lamb would milk the cow for us and or ewe. So beneficial microbes in sufficient numbers will outcompete harmful pathogenic microbes. This was our experience as we moved further and further into using it. Other things we utilized was diatomaceous earth hanging in jute bags, which the cows themselves would then go and dust themselves, and that prevented ticks and reduced the number of lice and flies on the animals. We had pigs running on the farm, so we had a very diverse operation. In 2007, a resilient, holistic, and integrative farming mindset in the head. You'll see still deteriorating soil and now foundation represented by the tan part of the whole farm, and farm gate wasn't no longer digited.
James, we're losing you. I think perhaps you can speed up and
Sorry about that, guys. We lost you again.
Yeah, if you could bring us to a conclusion just to allow a bit of time, James. We'll
do that, John. So, John, thanks very much. Just some final thoughts for everybody. We've been around not for too long compared to the rest of the life on this planet, and there's some ideas for people to consider. And if people want to contact me, there's my email address. I'm sure John and the PFLA will supply it there. Thanks so much, John.
It's all right. Just put up your last two slides. I mean, that's fine, but just conscious of we keep losing you. So.
Have you got that one, John?
Not yet. You want to just show the slide before the one,
There we go. Is that the one, John?
Yeah, and what's the one before with the, that's right. Yeah, just to show, not to go into detail, but just for people to see the sort of complexity of the farm and the interrelationship between all of this and the vital role and the fact that there are no artificial chemicals of any kind, entirely working with nature. It's very inspiring.
Yeah. Thanks very much, John. It's been a good challenge, but it's been wonderful learning. So people may ask, what am I going to do now? And what am I doing now? I sold Kirkington in 2014 and left it finally in 2018 after handing over to the new generation of farmers there. Sadly, yet I had a new vision that was born at Kirkington, which was fostered by nature, of course, and of people. And it was to deal with my mindset, which in the biologists who deal with human biology isn't called our human condition. And my aim now is to help other farmers understand what drives them to Bokashi, term I use, a tool to expand knowledge and self-knowledge. So thank you, John, for your invitation, and the organizers, fellow presenters, Jan and Mambud, and all the participants.
Thank you very much, James. James has written two interesting articles. In 2007, I was involved with with others setting up a thing called the International Center for Underutilized Crops. And we had an international meeting, and James came and gave a talk, and it's called Sowing Seeds of Success. And he gave another talk about 10 years later, and Jimmy, I don't know, I think you've got the links. Maybe you could put the links up on the chat box. But there are 2 papers there I encourage you to read, just to sort of to understand the background behind this. Right, so one of the questions, a question has been raised. Can fire ash be used? Mambud, is that something you would use in your preparation? You're on mute. This seems to be the most common phrase on Zoom.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, we can use, of course, biochar. You know, biochar consists of maybe you can use, as we say, rice husk charcoal. We are using rice husk charcoal, and you can also use maybe charcoal. And so actually, I have, of course, limited content, but if at all that is the only thing available you can use.
Thank you very much. Jan, I wonder if I could ask you, when you were talking about anaerobic, Bokashi being anaerobic with EM, and that was my understanding from reading Joseph, sort of Professor Higa's book. But both Mambud is not using the EM formula. He's taking the bugs from the soil, but he's doing it aerobically. And James was using aerobically and then went anaerobically. Could you give some thoughts on that the sort of the different
yeah what is most important to understand first is that the main types of microbes you use to make Bokashi are what we call facultative anaerobe. They can live in aerobic but also in anaerobic circumstances. They have some preference. Some have the preference aerobic, other has the preference anaerobic, but the main groups which are in EM in this case, but that is also what Mambud is, because the soil microbiology is for a big part aerobe and anaerobe as well. So after flooding, you don't lose all your microbes, you know, because the anaerobic after the flood dries up, at least a lot of them who needs air went into a spore when they become flooded, so in a rest, and when the oxygen comes back. But there is also a group what can live under both circumstances. So that's first. An example in nature you can see in a wood. When a forest, the leaves fall, yeah, that is also a fermentation what happens there. And it doesn't become hot because it is a very thin sliced what happens there. And the aerobic microbes, the aerobic fermentation microbes are so abundant there that the temperature doesn't go up. Temperature is caused by quite a lot of microbes who can't utilize oxygen very sufficient. And then you got heating up, what we do with compost. So what Mambud is, and he mentioned one important thing, his temperature doesn't go up to 50 degrees. Because if you go to the 70 degrees, you come to pasteurization. And that we always avoid. So he goes to 50 degrees, and the most facultative anaerobic microbes do very well at 50 degrees. But if you go to 70 or even higher, you kill them. So if you want to use ashes as a source for especially potash in your Bokashi heap, that is possible, unless you make the concentration too high, because then the electrical conductivity will kill them. So Bokashi is what we want to do is make huge heaps. We make Bokashi heaps in the Netherlands, a few 100 ton easily, yeah. And even our councils are working at with all the leaf what falls in the towns and the cities. They make Bokashi of it, but we want to speed that whole thing up. So we want to avoid competition, and then we use the EM microbes and we make it anaerobic, because if you make a big pile, then the heat comes from inside and it becomes no fermentation anymore, but it becomes composting, and the temperature goes easily up to 70 degrees and higher, and you lose a lot of CO2. Yeah, so you're losing actually energy. So it is two methods based on the same principle that you should stimulate the microbes you want. One way is don't let it get hot. The other way is, if there is not enough oxygen, it can't go hot. There is no oxidation, and those who can live aerobe and anaerobe will ferment the whole heap. Your beer is fermented, sauerkraut is fermented, wine is fermented, all anaerobic, and that means it keeps the energy. And that is actually the trick. And what Mambud does with his ingredients on smaller scale but higher concentration of ingredients, he is making actually a fertilizer in the way as we know fertilizers. What you do with big heaps, you're making less a fertilizer, but more food for the soil. The end effect will be more or less the same. But if you don't have enough organic matter, and we in England and in the Netherlands, we have a surplus of organic matter. We have so much organic matter what we don't use. We compost it or we even burn it because we don't know what all the cuttings from cider of the roads, all the leaves were falling in towns. We have to compost it. It's a pity because there's so much energy, and there are different ways. When I was in Japan, they taught me that Bokashi was another word for well-fermented organic matter. So, and there are different ways of fermentation. So if you know that, then so don't let it be past, stay below the 50 degrees or around the 50 degrees, yeah, or take the oxygen, but don't let the microbes who use oxygen pure to let the temperature rise, don't let them rule the heap of your organic matter. And that's actually the principle. I hope this answers your question.
That's very helpful indeed. Yes. Thank you, Jan. James, would you, what were the key lessons that you learned? You said I remember talking to you on occasions and sort of congratulating you on, the way things have meant. But you said, yes, John, but I've paid the school fees. That was a phrase I remember you saying for the mistakes you've made. And what would you say the key lessons that you'd learned that you would want to, from a practical point of view, you'd want to share with the farmers who are listening in?
John, the best thing one can get is to get information from other farmers who are doing this already. We don't have to invent the wheel. It's about sharing this knowledge, there's huge amounts of knowledge on the internet, but practical aspects of it, of actually doing it and making the Bokashi on scale, as Jan's mentioned, or on small scale, and Mambud's doing it. It's been done. There's no need to go through all the experimental stage, which can cost money. But to have someone, and with technology these days, it's so easy to connect as we connected now, bar the odd interruptions. So at the time when I was doing it, there weren't many people we could talk to in the 90s. So it was a lot of experimentation, and we lost a lot of Bokashi that went off. So talk and share. And as Jan says, even though we are competitive and we're competing in this world, it's clearly that the farm organism and microorganisms work better when they don't compete. In other words, when they're working together, and with beneficial microorganisms, you reach a stage where they outnumber the baddies and everything starts working together. And humans are no different, actually. We just, as Jan mentioned, we're just walking hosts for a bunch of microbes. So yeah, it's to talk and spread the information.
Let me ask you then, and then also ask Mambud and Jan. How can we get momentum going? I'm clearly in the Netherlands, it's much more accepted than it is here and is in Japan. But how do we get momentum? How do we persuade farmers? A lot of vested interest in people wanting to sell products and chemicals and all the rest of it. And I remember seeing on the Groundswell website, the accountant talking about the savings that can be made from no-till. Very, very significant economic savings that can be made. I mean, is there, from the data that you've shown us, Are there significant cost savings to be made from using Bokashi rather than bringing in chemicals and so on? What's the economic argument that we can use to encourage farmers to make the change?
Who you ask?
Oh, I'll ask James first, then Jan, and then Mambud. I'll ask you about how you're going to encourage farmers in Sierra Leone. Yeah, James first, and then Jan.
Thanks, John. Jan, having worked with Monsanto or for Monsanto, he knows the game better than I do, I guess. And unfortunately, it is about the bottom line from a financial perspective for farmers to survive. So the least cost method is what attracts farmers. But I think the present crisis, in terms of the pandemic and the existential crisis that we face as humans, we could leverage to push a more sustainable method. And sure, no-till outcompetes plowing at any stage. Just it's far better. And if one can get the Monsantos of the world on board to understand the crisis we're facing in terms of carbon and climate change, that they would develop very quickly a organically acceptable herbicide, which will make no-till organic farming possible. There are already trials been done with, I think it's a byproduct of the milling industry that is used to, I think it's one of the gluten products, as a herbicide, a natural herbicide. So that is the one way of getting in there, is to get the big guys on board, because they're the ones who actually set the trend and the pace.
Okay, Jan, thank you. You're on.
I think the first step we should do is a broader education to let people understand. If you are a farmer and you want to try to produce 15 tons of wheat per hectare, or you want to have more than 12,000 liters of milk per hectare, yeah, and those figures, don't start this route, because you will only be disappointed. You have to change your mindset, because 12 tons wheat per hectare is not automatically a better net income for the farmer. That is where it goes wrong. And that's the same with in arable and in dairy. If you know that, for example, if I take dairy, that a cow can get easily 10 years more or older, and that means around 8 lactations. And then we know that in England, the cow don't even have 3 lactations, and then it goes to the slaughterhouse. That means 2 years you have to feed a calf up to heifer with all the costs you have, and then you have 3 lactations to earn that heifer money back. Well, I think that's ridiculous, because the cow becomes most productive after his 5th lactation. If I go same to the wheat, if you look to a hectare of wheat, and I have examples plenty in the Netherlands where organic farmers on good soil, without fertilizers, grow around the 6 and the 7 tons of wheat per hectare, where the traditional farmers, they make 10 tons per hectare. Yeah. If you look into the efficiency of the nitrogen, that is terrible, because if you know that you can grow organic 6 tons and inorganic around the 10 tons, then you produce with 200 to 260 kilograms of nitrogen only 4 tons of wheat. If you take that in the carbon footprint in account, they should pay farmers then, if they want to pay for carbon footprint, there is a huge gap for 4,000 kilograms of wheat, yeah, to gain that with 200 to 250 kilograms of nitrogen. If you see the machinery, the costs and everything we have to do, the erosion and everything, to gain those huge amounts of product, unfortunately, it has to be done. Otherwise, those big farmers and also the farmers has no income. But we should look more at the cost side, because a lot of the costs are made in agriculture these days are paid back by the taxpayer. A government should also look, if we don't have all those costs for repair and all the trouble, yeah, what would be then the brute national income for the country? It is not only what you earn, yeah, what comes in. You have also look at the cost to make it, the net income. And I think to take a different approach, yeah, and to do it. But it is, I know it is in contradiction with the laws of Mr. Keynes, the economic steward of this economy we have today. But it doesn't mean it can't be done. It needs a different attitude.
All right, thanks. And Mambud, I've got a couple other questions coming in, but Mambud, can you just explain how you're encouraging farmers in Sierra Leone to follow your method?
Oh, yes. Of course, in Sierra Leone, not much of this organic things is not being communicated to farmers. And so when I came back 3 years ago, I tried to visit some farms, especially in Western area where we are working, Western District. And so about 150 farmers, tried to visit some few of them, and then also introduce the first conference, agriculture conference, to introduce organic farming. So of course, I saw how interesting, the farmers are. They want to hear more, they want to practice. Some of them have already started practicing the organic farming using Bokashi. But then the opportunity now is how we could make sure that this kind of approach is being communicated, shared with among the other farmers in the district, in the outlined communities in Sierra Leone. And so at our permaculture farm, permaculture agroecology farm, we have designed a training program, a training program for this year, whereby we will come with the amputees. First of all, we want to target the amputees, bring them, and then give them training, because most of them are also farmers in their communities. So there we go as a new trainees, to share these ideas with them. But also we want to bring farmers themselves also, maybe for a day, for 3 days, so that we can teach them in our farm. And this is why, we have already done this preparation of having a very good infrastructure in our farm. In our 10-acre farm, we have already got training facilities, nutrition hall, and all these kind of facilities. So once we have funding, we want to make sure that we continue our training activities. Farmers come, amputees comes, and then so that we can learn together, we can share together, and at the end of the day, we will handle the ecological problems, the erosion, the climate challenges, harsh climate challenges in our communities, sickness, illness, so many illness as a result of it, synthetic chemical fertilizers we are using.
Thank you very much, Mambud. Just a couple of quick questions. I think these, Jan, are for you. Surely anaerobic Bokashi is no different to in silage. Why can't we just use well-chosen silage bacteria? And then, and then someone says, can we use wood chip as a carbon source with manure to make Bokashi?
The first question is, silage additives are mainly based on 2 types of microbes, and that is from the same family, lactic acid microbes. And in the mix of fermentation, they are very important, but they are not only important. You miss quite a lot of groups of what work with fermentation. So it's not only lactic acid. Another thing is what we do when we make Bokashi, we keep also look at the pH. You need in big heap Bokashis, when you make a silage heap, the pH, they become stable because the pH goes around between the 3.8 and 4.2. That is that low that microbial activity stops. And as people know, if you have good silage and you try to bring that in the soil, that won't eaten away by the microbes in the soil just because it is too acidic. So we need something to keep that pH around the 6 to 7. So that is maybe an answer on that one. The other one was wood chips. You can, but if the wood is too thick, it takes the microbes too much time to break down the lignin, because wood has a CN ratio from around a 300 carbon to 1 nitrogen. Straw has 80 to 1, while the most microbes, they prefer a CN ratio from 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So what you really want to make microbial activity, you have to strive to a CN of around a 20 to 1. the 300, if you make the only wood chips, what absolutely shouldn't use is pine, because the gum in a pine tree is very much antibacterial. So you call it, you know what I mean with the gum of, sorry? Yeah. It's not the sap, it's that sticky stuff in pine trees. That is antibacterial. So if you use parts of alum or something like that, it's no problem as long as you make it fine enough. You can use twigs, for example, quite easily, but it needs to sit longer before the fermentation, because breakdown of lignin is a lot of energy for the microbes and takes a lot of time.
Thank you, Jan. One last question, and this is from Barney in Zimbabwe. Hello, Barney. We've been having a lot of communication on email. And it says, James, I'm in Zimbabwe. Do you think maize can be used as an alternative to some of the material? Let's say as an alternative, what you call bran and hay for molasses.
That imagine, Barney, that would be maize bran, and absolutely we use maize bran and turn it into bokashi.
That's great. I can perhaps put the two of you in touch, because Barney's starting a very interesting new farm in Zimbabwe. Barney's Savanam. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, for me anyway, it's been very exciting getting Bokashi up on the agenda. And I'm hugely grateful to Jan and to Mambud and to James for participating and sharing their experience. There is a second webinar on Bokashi planned, about which more information will come later, which I think will involve UK farmers who are actually using, it'll be organized by, I think, led by Andrew, who are actually using Bokashi in this country. So another chance to find how it can be used here. But I really felt that this topic, it's an international issue, and we can be quite parochial in the UK. We are an island nation, and there's so much we can learn from elsewhere. So I'm very grateful to Jan, Mambud, and James. I think we'll sign off here, let you know when the next session is coming up, and huge thanks. And I hope you leave with a little bit of inspiration and some thoughts for the future. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, James.